There's a lot of things that you learn as a journalist that are exactly the wrong skills and talents that you need as a leader. You know, journalism is quite a self-centred business in some ways. There's quite a lot of ego involved in it. You're very assumption-based in the way you think. Leadership is exactly the opposite of all of those things. You don't jump to the conclusion before you've properly assessed the issue or before you've devised a strategy to, build a path, before you've brought a team together and tried to bring the best parts of the team to the fore so that as a group you are much better than the individuals are.
There's this point for any leader where you have to move from being on the tools, one of the troops, to being in charge. And if you've spent most of your life questioning authority, it's quite tricky when you move to being the authority. Gaven Morris has been a reporter for CNN, Al Jazeera and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. But when he stepped into one of the key media executive roles in the country, overseeing some 1,300 journalists, well, he had to learn a whole new set of skills as a leader. He'd also have to lead through a period of radical change while also dealing with some heavy issues on the home front. Gaven Morris is responsible for most of the news you watch every day, whether it's the story you read on the ABC News website, perhaps a Four Corners investigation, or rolling coverage of a bushfire or flood on the ABC's news channel. He's recently announced he's stepping down from the role of Director of News with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation after 6 years in that leadership role. And it can be a pretty gruelling job. You're managing thousands of journalists around the country working to a 24/7 news cycle. There's the pressure of ratings and audience expectations. And there's also a level of political pressure from the government of the day who like to keep a check on how taxpayer funds are spent at the national broadcaster. So amid all that, how do you also keep one eye on the future so you can keep pace with the rapid change in the media? How do you maintain a proactive leadership style when news can be so reactive? Gaven Morris, welcome to Curveball.
Thanks, Kel. Very honoured to be part of the Curveball alumni, which has got some incredible people, over the podcasts in recent times.
In 2008, you were watching coverage of the US election, and Barack Obama was, of course, elected as the first African-American president. And this for you was a bit of a light bulb moment.
So I've just returned to Australia and just returned to the ABC after a decade or so overseas in international news. And I thought, wow, this is an incredible moment in history. An African-American is about to be elected US president for the first time. We are a big broadcaster. We've got hundreds and many staff. We've got a Washington bureau. Let's kind of do a bunch of special rolling coverage around this incredible event. And as I say, I just got back into the building, and really the answer from everybody was, well, that's just not what we do. We don't have the capacity to do that. And so I think my quip at the time was it was the yes we can election and the no we can't moment at the ABC. And I thought right then and there, okay, this has got to change. For taxpayers to get full value out of the ABC, we have got to be able to do live rolling coverage around big historical events. And that was really where the whole journey at the ABC started, right there.
So you were given the mandate to mount a news channel, but internally you were met with a little bit of resistance.
Well, almost universally, either the old salts in the ABC were of the view that the ABC had tried this a couple of times before and it had failed then and would fail this time. And many of the people in the newsrooms thought that, what's the point of doing this kind of cheap and cheerful rolling news thing when really what we're about is journalism and telling rich stories and doing all of those sorts of things. I think one of the issues was in Australia, we didn't have a lot of knowledge of what a news channel was able to do for audiences. Obviously we had Sky News over on a subscription service, but most Australians had never really had an experience of watching a television news channel do the news live. So there was a big education transformation piece for us. But yeah, internally, that cultural resistance to really change the methodology of what we were doing, even though the audience had changed completely, was the first obstacle we came up against.
And the channel was also funded from internal savings, which I assume means it was sort of run on the smell of an oily rag. I think there were some key press conferences missed in the early days. So how hard was it to get this 24/7 news channel off the ground?
So the technology was brand new. The methodology and the way editorially we were putting together was a new experience for the ABC. We had to come on air 3 or 4 months earlier than we planned because the election, we'd said we'd be on air for the federal election, and Julia Gillard had called the election earlier than everyone expected. So, lack of preparation time, new technology, new workflows, and an internal sort of climate where it wasn't exactly welcomed by everybody. It was a pretty rough ride in the beginning. And I remember one of those kind of almost farcical moments where we were trying to cover live events. We had live trucks, but no live truck operators because we never really needed them before. And I thought, okay, we've got to almost start again here in just thinking through the methodology of what a contemporary news organisation is.
So how did you deal with this in those dark times and keep going? Like, what was it about the brief and the role that meant that you carried on when actually it was very daunting?
I think I got to the point of thinking that I would go home many days and feel quite sort of down and feel defeated by the fact that we just weren't doing as well as we wanted to. And I really felt for the team. Here were all these people that had come on board to launch this thing and to try something new in the Australian media landscape. And I felt for them because it was really tough for many of the people on the team as well. So I think I just got this sense of determination that for them, as much as anything else, we were going to prove that this thing could be good, and we were going to persist and make it better step by step, day by day. And that was really the approach that we then took. We built quite a good esprit de corps then within that team of saying, look, everybody else might not want us, like us, think we're doing a good job, but we're going to get there. We're going to do this. And that sense of team and that sense of bringing together a group of people and finding a common purpose and then putting our heads down and getting on with it was a great lesson to learn. Eventually,
it did turn around. I think it took a big news event in the Brisbane floods to kind of have that switch.
So there's nothing like the centre of one of our big cities being inundated with a flood to kind of pull a news team together. And what we were able to do was simulcast the news channel's coverage of the Brisbane floods on the ABC main channel. But more than that, we brought all of the stars of ABC News into that coverage. And so whether you had Joe O'Brien in the field or Lisa Miller or Phil Williams or our best presenters and reporters, Scott Bevan, Ali Moore, they were all involved in that coverage. And I think for the first time, both the public and people in our newsroom said, now we can see what this is for. Now we understand why this is a service to be valued. Our audience went up, I think, exponentially during that period. And the news channel audience never really went down again. It continued to grow from that point on. And from there, we got better at what we did. We really started to get experience in the team. We'd worked the technology out, and from there, bit by bit, we did get better as a channel. And now it's an invaluable service that you can't imagine life without, I think.
So let's go back to your beginnings in journalism, because you actually started in newspapers.
I absolutely was determined to be a newspaper journalist. That's all I really ever wanted to be. And so I got a job at the end of, in my last year at uni at the Canberra Times, which is my hometown. And I loved it. It was a terrific job. And I thought, well, this is it. This is all I ever want to do. But one thing led to another, and they were frustrating me a little bit in offering me a full-time job. So back then there used to be journalism jobs in the newspaper. And so I in a fit of precociousness on one weekend, I applied to every single journalism job in the newspaper. And funnily enough, literally months later, I got a letter back from one of them, which was a job at the ABC on a youth current affairs show. And so, suddenly I had to think through whether newspapers was going to be my future or whether I would go in another direction.
And it's a show called Attitude. It's sort of a youth current affairs show. I mean, I don't know, Gavin. I don't sort of pick you as the sort of grungy youth, the sort of hungry beast sort of reporter. Can you talk through what your role on the show was?
I was the boring one who wore a tie and covered Canberra. And I think even then people would look at the pictures of me on Attitude and all the rest of it and think, wow, that is the kind of oldest 20-something I've ever seen. I was not the funky one. I was not the dashing one. I was the dull one and the serious one. And so, but I have to tell you, it was the best job I have ever had. It was an absolute blast for 2 years. I was 20 when I joined that program. And for 2 years, we travelled across Australia, met all sorts of incredible people, told long-form stories, had a primetime slot on ABC television, a great team and a great bunch of colleagues, great leaders and really good senior producers who taught us a lot about making television. And I was very lucky to start in a job like that, although every job I've had since has always been something of a disappointment because it was so much fun.
One of the things, though, about working in the media is it can be so fickle. Like 1 minute you're hot and the next you're not. So how long did Attitude last?
It went for 2 years and then I was made redundant by the ABC. They axed the show and I lost my job. And, so I can proudly say that, it taught me a lot about never loving an organisation. You can love your mission, you can love what you're doing at the time, but don't ever think that an organisation will love you back. When at a point in time where they don't need you anymore, you can be pushed out the door pretty swiftly. So I was made redundant by the ABC and that was the end of Attitude after 2 great years.
You went on to work in Canberra and you worked for Channel 10 for a while. The start of your journalism career is quite varied, a stint in Parliament House, but you were feeling a little lost after a while and decided to head overseas. What were you in search of?
I literally thought it was maybe time for a career change, and I went and studied international relations at the ANU, and that's when I was also working at the 10 Bureau, which I really enjoyed, but I was thinking, look, maybe it's time for me to do something different. I went on holidays to London, and I was never one of those people that had a grand plan to go and live in London or work in London, but I went on holidays there, and the .com boom was in full swing. And it blew my mind. There were people making their fortunes all over the place. There were pages and pages full of ads about, join this startup and make your fortune. And everything in the media was about this incredible .com boom. And I thought, wow, this is not happening in Australia yet. I've got to come over here and learn about this. So the one sensible thing I did in my impetuous decision to kind of jet off around the world and find a job somewhere else was to find a .com job, but with a broadcaster, because I had a bit of broadcast experience then. And so I applied and won and was sponsored to go and work for CNN.com Europe, which was CNN at the time was hiring 150 people to launch this massive website all around the world. And I was on the first team that they brought on board in London to do the Europe end of CNN.com.
Could you see then where this whole internet thing and news on demand was heading? Like, did you have a sense of how dramatic the change would be in the delivery of news?
You got a real sense of how quickly things were changing right then and there in front of your eyes. And I don't think anybody really knew where it would go, but the pace of change and the scale of change that was happening during those early years of the .com boom, I think we've forgotten what that was like, because it was phenomenal. And I just thought, I want to be a part of this. I want to hop on that wave and I want to ride it for as long as I can and see what I can learn. I've always thought that the keys to a great career are to ensure that you're always learning and you're always kind of on an upward trajectory in terms of your knowledge and your understanding of things. And so doing that .com job and joining CNN.com at the very start and trying to build something from scratch was terrific fun, but it kept you so engaged in what you were doing every day. That learning curve, I think, was the reason why I've sought a lot of the opportunities I have along the way.
Then, of course, a defining moment for so many in the media, which is September 11. How did that impact on your career?
So look, funnily enough, the dot-com bust had happened then. So 6 months after I joined CNN.com, the dot-com bust happened, and literally within months, everything was shut down. So I knew people, for instance, that had started a startup in London with 100 people who was, there selling the last desks as the whole thing had shut down and everyone had gone. So CNN did the same. They shut CNN.com pretty much. And in London, I was one of the few people that had broadcast experience, so they moved me over into the television newsroom while I was starting some new business shows. So there we are in the CNN London office watching this crazy picture of a plane in the top of the World Trade Center and thinking, I remember us having a bit of a giggle about it and said, what sort of pilot doesn't spot the World Trade Center? Thinking it was a little Cessna or something like that. And then literally live, standing there in the office, we watched the second plane fly into the other building. And of course, CNN at the time was, almost this defunct model of the media. The dot-com thing was going to get there in the end, and satellite TV news was on the decline. Well, everything changed in that moment. CNN was back as the king of the media. It was the source for September 11 and for everything that followed. And so we all, within hours, really knew that our lives had changed and that the result of the terrorist attacks in America on that day were going to then dominate CNN's agenda for the coming years. And so my career literally changed on that day, and I was thrown into breaking news, live news, deployed into the field, and sort of off I went through that very tumultuous period that followed 2001.
You see a lot of things when you're a reporter on the road, and I think, people see the face on the television and you're reporting, but I don't think they really understand how grueling it is moving from place to place and some of the trauma and the terror that you see. How did that impact you?
I think really profoundly. I mean, what happened for the next 5 years is really I was on the road the whole time, going to many places when they were at their very worst. I was in the Iraq War for the whole period of the Iraq War. I did civil wars in Africa. I was there for the second Intifada in the Middle East, and lots of disasters and natural disasters. It was a very busy time in news, and at CNN we were just peddling much beyond the capacity of any human to keep up with it all. So I was on the road the whole time, either as a producer or as a correspondent. And you're right. So often what would happen is you were helicoptered in, almost literally, but you were dropped into a place you'd never been before that often you had not a lot of understanding about, in a situation that was perilous in every sense of the word. And then you would see incredibly awful things happen in front of you. And I think it deeply affected me in ways I didn't recognise at the time. And I think that that's what happens with many journalists and many emergency workers and soldiers and people that find themselves in this. Your brain is very good at dealing with the trauma of something that's happening at the time, but it then takes a long time to rewind that. And I think what stayed with me all through the years since then are some of the human stories that I came across along the way, people that I'd met who were in an awful situation that I couldn't really do anything to help. And it's taken me a long time to deal with many of those stories, I think, just in terms of that empathy that you probably try to pack away a little bit at the time, but it never really escapes you that you've seen and experienced these things, and more importantly, these people that you've encountered have been right in the middle of it.
And of course, there's the people affected by the story, but there's also the other people around you. So when, for people who don't know how it works, when you go into one of these war zones or an area that you're not from, usually the media organisation puts you together with a person called a fixer. And their job really is to be the local contact to help you with the resources you need on the ground to cover the story. Tell me about Tony Hope, who was a fixer that you met along the way.
So I'm in Monrovia, which is the capital of Liberia, and the one thing I told CNN I would never do was an African civil war, and I found myself in the middle, sort of by accident really, but found myself in the middle of Monrovia as the rebels were attacking the city. We'd worked with Tony, who was a local Liberian guy, really great person, really sort of gentle soul, and he was our producer on the ground in Monrovia. Anyway, we got to the point in time where we'd been advised by the US military that we just had to leave, that we were, the centre of the city was going to be overrun by the rebels, and it was time for us to get out of there. At one point, we were evacuated to the US Embassy in Monrovia, and it was getting attacked. There were mortars coming over the fence, bullets coming through the ceiling, and they just said, look, we can't protect you anymore. You've got to get to the airport. So we go back, we pack up, everything's going on around us. It's total chaos. And Tony just assumed he was coming with us. And we said, well, Tony, we can't take Liberian citizens out of the country. You don't have a visa. And he said, but I'm part of this team. Like, how can this team be leaving and you leave me behind in what's going on here? And it's taken me years and years and years of thinking about Tony just to really understand how, one, the media works in those environments where you genuinely do work as a team with the local people, but two, in the end, you then often leave them behind. And, now Tony was fine. We put him up in the safest hotel in Monrovia for as long as it took for the violence to subside, and Tony went on and he was, he in the end, he was safe. But nevertheless, he literally was physically hanging on to me saying, you can't leave me behind. This is, I'm part of your team. And I've never forgotten it. It's I think of it all the time, even today.
Does that affect how you, when you become the Director of News at the ABC, deal with the way that we now work when we're sending reporters into the field? Has some of this informed how we treat fixers going forward, or what responsibility we have to the people we kind of drag into these horrific situations?
We do. Look, the other circumstance I went through, which has also profoundly affected me, was we were in Iraq when all the sort of attacks on the media were sort of starting to ramp up, and with CNN, and we lost 2 team members. They were killed in one of these attacks in a convoy with CNN correspondent and camera crew and producer, and meeting their families and, absolutely sort of seeing the consequence of what can happen when a local journalist working with an international team is killed. Often they were the main source of income for the family, and that's why they were doing a job like that. It really does. And so look, in all of those senses, I hope the media is getting better at the way it both treats its own people in those environments, but also the people that it meets along the way. Although I'm very mindful that you look at the situation in Afghanistan at the moment after what's happened this year, there are so many dozens of people who have either helped the military or helped diplomatic missions or helped the media in Afghanistan that found themselves left behind. And I don't know what the solution is there, but when something like what's happened in Afghanistan this year occurs, you really do think, wow, you can't imagine things going that backwards, but they do, and we've all got to think about that.
I think around this time, you start to feel a little burnt out, which is very understandable after 5 years on the road. And I think your wife was starting to get a little bit sick of you being on the road as well. So where did you go next?
So I just met my now wife, Kirsten, and we'd met in London and we'd been seeing each other for a little while. And then I'd do this stint in Baghdad, and she's a journalist, so she understands what I was doing. But then we lose the staff members, and she finds my lifestyle very unromantic at this point. And I thought, okay, I've got a decision to make, because I'd had a few other relationships that hadn't worked out because people found my lifestyle very unromantic. And I thought, she's more important to me than, going to these places and doing these sorts of jobs. So I literally called time on it and said, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm not going to travel in the field anymore. And so we sort of decide it's probably time for us to start thinking about heading home. But we make a stop off on the way, and we both go to Doha and help start Al Jazeera English, which was the biggest news channel startup in the world at the time. And off we go to Doha. We thought for a year maybe, we'd work on this project and then keep going home. Well, we stayed there for 3 years and really got to the point of setting up part of the team that set up the whole channel. 4 broadcast centres around the world, something like 30-odd bureaus, and a very different news agenda to CNN or BBC. And so we had this incredible experience of living and working in the Middle East, of starting this massive news channel, of meeting all sorts of people from all around the world, and we had a blast.
And I think this helps really with your next steps. And your first son with Kirsten was born in Doha, but I imagine Australia was still calling because that's where you were meant to be going before that little stop off. And you take on this role to run continuous news at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, as we mentioned at the top of the show. Eventually then, though, the director of news then, Kate Tawney, steps down. You've been the deputy to her in a lot of ways, which largely means you're rolling up your sleeves and you're just getting stuff done, which is kind of your, that's what you do, right? You go into Al Jazeera and you build a news channel. How did you adjust when you eventually stepped into the main news director role? What had to change for you as a leader?
There's a lot of things that you learn as a journalist that are exactly the wrong skills and talents that you need as a leader. Journalism is quite a self-centered business in some ways. There's quite a lot of ego involved in it. You're very assumption-based in the way you think. So you're always writing the story, but while you're in the crew car on the way to go there, before you've done an interview, you can do a shooting script, or you actually imagine the sound bites that you'd like the person, based on research and all of that sort of stuff. But you jump to the conclusion, and you've got a deadline. You aim to get your story up by that deadline. Leadership is exactly the opposite of all of those things. You don't jump to the conclusion before you've properly assessed the issue, or before you've devised a strategy to, build a part, before you've brought a team together and tried to bring the best parts of the team to the fore, so that, as a group, you are much better than the individuals are. All of these things are totally the different skill set. And so I think anybody that moves from being a working journalist to being an executive or a leader goes through that process. And it's renowned in newsrooms that there are many journalists that make terrible leaders, and for all of those reasons, I think. And for me, it was just a very steep learning curve with lots of mistakes and stuff-ups along the way, I've got to say, because I was learning on the job. I remember having a conversation with Mark Scott when he first asked me if I wanted to be considered for the role. And I said to him, Mark, what has the ABC done to prepare me to run a division with a $200 million budget and 1,300 staff? I was just kind of running a news channel. So one, I don't think as organisations, media organisations, we're necessarily good at training and building leaders of the future. But secondly, I think for the people that put themselves in those positions, you really got to understand that you've got to learn a lot. You've got to listen better than perhaps I listened at the beginning. You've got to not jump to conclusions and make assumptions. And so you've really got to retrain your brain in every way you can imagine. And that's the process I went through, I think, in the first year or two of that job.
Gaven Morris has put his doubts aside and stepped into a leadership role. But the learning curve hasn't flattened out just yet. In part 2 on Curveball, Gaven navigates the transition from being in the trenches to watching from the command tower. At the same time, there's a perfect storm of personal struggles, which affects both Gaven's family and his teammates.
There was a period there where both my kids were unwell, where you're right, there was a lot of quite upsetting things that were happening just by coincidence at the same time. The chopper crash was devastating for everybody in the ABC, and John Bean in particular was a good friend of mine. He was the cameraman who was on board that day, but I knew Paul and Gary as well. So all of these things were going on at the same time, within a space of a couple of years there. And I can honestly say there were times where I sat there at my desk. I think there were probably, particularly when family illness was a factor, times where I sat at my desk, looked at a screen for 8 hours, didn't lift a finger, couldn't get motivated to do anything. And, at times where I resented being at work. I would rather have been anywhere else.
Download the second part of this interview right now. It's in your podcast feed. And you'll also hear Gaven's thoughts on how you lead into the future when the future is eating the very thing that you've always been.